Here's the empirical reality as best we can tell. If you believe that polls have any value, then the polls are saying that Joe Biden's support has not materially budged in 5 months. Those are national polls and state polls. He's still hovering around 30% support in the national polls and maintains a relatively comfortable lead in the early states that vote in the primary process, especially South Carolina, where his lead continues to be of landslide proportions. So that, I would think, should prompt some reflection in the media and political class, because any honest assessment of the dynamics of the Democratic primary race thus far should tell you that there is a widespread hostility to the notion of Joe Biden being the Democratic nominee in the media and among the operative class. They do not feel that it is a proper representation of the Democratic Party for its standard bearer at this juncture, after everything that's gone on with Trump since 2016, to be a, quote, old white man. Now, that's not a logic that I think is particularly well grounded, but that is how a lot of people feel who have positions of influence and can dictate the terms of the news cycle. So how have they chosen to go after Biden for the most part up until this point? Well, first, it was this idea that he was a low-grade sex pest of some kind, where just after he announced his campaign in April, you had a raft of stories that didn't quite accuse him of committing a Me Too offense, but were on the border of that. And that had no impact, at least in terms of the polling standings. People did not buy this idea that Joe Biden was a sexual predator because there are some weird videos of him hugging young women. Okay? That simply did not work. What came next? Well, there was the whole brouhaha at the first debate where Kamala Harris decided to make a show and accuse Joe Biden, in essence, of being a racist. Now, Kamala Harris phrased it in this sleazy way where she said, "Hey, Joe, I'm not calling you a racist, but," as if anybody in their right mind couldn't apprehend what that is supposed to connote. So that was a month plus of news cycles. And, interspersed in between were, occasional resurrections of old comments or votes of his on other subjects that were supposed to degrade his candidacy in some fashion. And what's the current narrative? Well, it's that old Joe is back up to his habits of committing, quote, gaffes. Now, it drives me absolutely crazy when journalists use these words and phrases that exist only in their weird little vernacular structure. Have you ever heard anybody in normal life refer to some verbal mishap or screw up as a, quote, gaffe? I have not. Maybe it happens in some weird scenario that I cannot envision in normal parlance, but my best inference is that the word gaffe tends to only be used by journalists and pundits when they want to characterize some verbal embarrassment committed by a politician. Now, the typical cliched definition of gaffe is when a politician stumbles over his or her words and conveys something other than what they meant. Or there's another definition where they convey a thought that is regarded as uncouth and reflects badly on them. But the word gaffe was never supposed to characterize evidence of cognitive decline, which is clearly any reasonable observer should attest what's going on with Biden. You only have to watch him performing on the campaign trail to ascertain that he is undergoing what looks like pretty clear age-related decline. It wouldn't be shocking for somebody who's going to be turning 77 years old in November to be undergoing such a process, and you'd think that professional writers and journalists and commentators would have the vocabulary available to them to accurately depict that process, but they simply don't, and that's why they use this nonsense term gaffe. Because they tend to be quite lazy thinkers who simply parrot whatever the common talking point of the day is. And so they've been describing these episodes of Biden's as gaffes. And so it follows in the tradition of using badly framed attacks against Biden that are not going to have any appreciable effect on his standing in the polls or in his ability to ultimately secure the presidential nomination for the Democratic Party. Because it's already priced in to Biden's public persona that he is, quote, gaffe prone. People already understand that the whole Biden shtick, has incorporated into it this notion that he occasionally commits a goofy gaffe, and it's almost regarded as endearing. It enhances his mystique in a way and kind of kindles this nostalgic attachment to him that many Democrats have. Because for the 8 years that he was alongside Obama, he would occasionally have a gaffe, but it was a lovable gaffe. It was a gaffe that, helped Obama or reinforced an attractive image of Biden and Obama together. So rather than use this cliched term to describe what is pretty obvious cognitive decline, I would humbly suggest that journalists and commentators and others who at least purport to be professionals and to have the ability to accurately describe what's going on in public affairs, to stop using the word gaffe. Please. Gaffe is not what you'd use to describe somebody's cognitive decline in any other area of life. If your grandmother was consistently failing to remember names, losing track of time, not able to communicate basic ideas or recall basic facts, you wouldn't call those things gaffes, would you? You would say that probably suggests some kind of underlying medical condition that is consistent with the aging process. So by using the word gaffe, journalists, maybe unwittingly or in some cases wittingly, actually bolster Biden and insulate him from scrutiny because they're obscuring what's really going on with him. They're imposing a benign explanation for what really ought to be a very disturbing recurrent series of events, which is that he's not able to articulate thoughts coherently. He frequently loses his train of thought for just simple statements. And yes, was Biden always the most articulate speaker? No, he wasn't. But you can go and watch his debates just 12 years ago in the 2007-8 cycle with Obama, Hillary Clinton, John Edwards, and the rest of the gang, and find that Biden back then was orders of magnitude more competent in terms of his verbal acuity and his ability to communicate coherent ideas and to speak extemporaneously, which is a necessity on a presidential campaign. You'll notice that in many of his appearances now, his handlers provide him with scripted remarks, which he still fails to deliver competently. So, maybe the journalists don't realize this, but by attributing these constant cognitive malfunctions to his pre-existing proclivity to commit gaffes, they actually are helping Biden because they're giving him an excuse to ward off criticisms that would be supremely relevant now. Oh, it's just gaffe-prone Joe. It's just Joe doing what he's always done, committing a funny gaffe now and then. No. He's exhibiting signs of cognitive decline, and that needs to be emphasized in the media, or else this idea that Biden is the most electable Democratic candidate in the running is going to persist. Democrats, by wide margins, somehow believe that Biden is the most electable against Trump. Well, are you really the most electable if you can barely string together a couple words? Or if virtually every day, when speaking off the cuff, you say something that is incredibly embarrassing and reminiscent of what your great uncle who's turning 77 might say on occasion that reflects their inability to perform as they might have when they were younger? So the media, in its own perverse way, seems to be intent on helping Biden by giving him this built-in justification for his poor performance. So rather than going with the Me Too stuff or the racism stuff or the gaffe stuff, the way to really diminish Biden, who has always been a formidable candidate, in my estimation, at least for the Democratic nomination, is to introduce a new narrative. And a narrative that cuts against the central argument for his candidacy, which is that he is magically the most electable against Trump. The way that you cut against that argument is to show that no, the actual opposite is true, in that somebody undergoing serious and obvious age-related decline is the polar opposite of electable. He's the riskiest against Trump. He's not in a position where he can competently wage a campaign against Trump in light of the daily embarrassments. And they're not gaffes. The word gaffe trivializes that concern and that criticism. So, unless journalists extricate themselves from this cliched phraseology that they're so committed to, the same dynamic with Biden is almost certain to continue. Now, is he invincible? No. But if you're somebody who would like to see Biden not win the nomination, the media is not doing you any favors, and nor are the other candidates. Anyway, I discussed this subject in a column today at The Spectator, which I will link to. Read that for further thoughts, and I will talk to you later.